The biggest bottleneck in healthcare AI aren't the models. I think it's the data, and it's just not healthcare. I'm talking about AI in general. Most organizations, they're not struggling anymore with building AI, but they're struggling with using data safely. Data within healthcare is uniquely hard for a few reasons. First, it's highly sensitive. Second, the data is fragmented, right? I mean, it sits across so many places within electronic health record systems, but what they're actually going to be doing with that data and what's the intent behind that data, that typically is not understood within our traditional security systems and guardrails.
Today's conversation is with Sid Dutta, a cybersecurity veteran who has been a data protection executive across various large corporations such as American Express, Worldpay, Activision Blizzard King, and product head of voltage data security at Micro Focus, which is now OpenText. He is now the founder and CEO of Privaclave AI, which is solving some of the deep-rooted challenges in protecting sensitive data, especially now in the age of AI. Sid's work focuses on one of the most constrained layers in AI data flows. While much of the market is focused on models and algorithms, his perspective centers on the runtime visibility, governance, and protection that bakes in privacy and trust by default and by design. He works on enabling secure, privacy-preserving collaboration, making it possible to analyze and process sensitive data within healthcare, financial services, and other industry sectors across legacy and AI workflows without exposing it and impacting it to customer or patient privacy. That shift has implications not just for innovation, but for how institutions think about risk, partnerships, and accountability. This conversation focuses on where AI efforts stall before they begin, what is limiting progress today, and what needs to change for healthcare data to be used safely and effectively at scale. Sid, I want to start with the layer that gets the least amount of attention. Before we do, I want to say thank you for being here and welcome to the Signal Room.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
So AI gets most of the focus in healthcare right now, but a lot of initiatives stall long before models are ever deployed. Where do organizations actually hit barriers when it comes to data? And why is healthcare data so difficult to access and collaborate around compared to other industries?
Oh, it's a loaded question. So I'm gonna break it apart a little bit, but I think that's a great place to start the conversation, right? Because honestly, the biggest bottleneck in healthcare AI, aren't the models, right? I think it's the data, and it's just not healthcare. I'm talking about AI in general. Most organizations, they're not struggling anymore, with building AI, but they're struggling, with using their data safely. And comes to healthcare, data within healthcare is uniquely hard for a few reasons, right? First, it's highly sensitive. You're dealing with PHI, protected health information, regulated
Right.
under HIPAA, and the risk isn't just financial. It's patient trust and safety. So that makes
Yes.
organizations extremely cautious. Second, the data is fragmented, right? I mean, it sits across so many places within electronic health record systems or electronic medical record systems, imaging
Right.
systems, labs, billing platforms, all in different formats, different owners, and often, with limited interoperability. And then the controls typically that are implemented at these platforms, particularly with the environment systems like Epic and Sun, they're very well maintained as long as the data is sitting within those platforms, but they don't travel with the data. The moment data
Right.
leaves the EHR boundary, whether it's going to an AI model, a copilot essentially accessing it, or an agentic AI framework where an agent goes from being an MCP client, talks to an MCP server to access EHR as a tool or resource, or even for patient analytics, sending to a third party or in a cloud collaboration. All those native protections are gone at that point, right? It's kind of in a wild, wild west.
Right.
So that's where I think typically where we would find that the initiatives will stall because now security and compliance teams, they are concerned about that. We don't really have visibility and control. And we also don't understand some of the intent because typically when it gets to the non-deterministic aspect of, AI identities, what we call as non-human identities, that
Right.
we know who is accessing and what they're allowed to access, but what they're actually going to be doing with that data and what's the intent behind that data, that typically is not understood within our traditional security systems and guardrails. So
Right.
that kind of leads to, delays of projects and then typically you're not moving past pilots and POCs. And compared to other industries, healthcare has a much lower tolerance of risk, right? So, but it's still relying on security models that were designed for static systems and not
Yeah.
dynamic AI workflows, and that's probably what the gap is, between data access and data protection slowing down.
That's an important point you just mentioned too. It was because healthcare by definition has never been static, but we've always measured things like it is. The pace things are moving at this point, it's really kind of imperative that what you're talking about, we're bringing it to the forefront and having these conversations, and people are understanding how urgent it is that we start to think about this differently because of the fact the pace is what it is. And it's not static. The practice of medicine has always been considered a practice. And unfortunately, we keep discovering new things, probably because they're self-imposed in terms of the health conditions that seem to be popping up every so often. When COVID-19 was like, I think we all heard about SARS, but that was a whole nother level that we'd never seen before. And I don't think there's any shortage of those things in the future. And I don't mean epidemics or pandemics, but just new conditions because of all the crazy things that we think are improving our lives, whether it's chemicals or whatever that go into food processes. But getting to some of the challenges from an organizational standpoint, and when you're talking about interoperability, it's always been a complaint that physicians have had that I've talked to. But there's a lot of legitimate reasons organizations actually need to collaborate and share data. What are some of the concerns that you see that pop up first?
Yeah, I think the first concern I would say that will pop up is what happens if that data got exposed, right? So typically, when the collaboration is happening, there is either a data share agreement in place in terms of ensuring that as the data essentially is shared with other entities, the onus of protecting the data kind of lies with them. But that,
Right.
at the end of the day, compliance and security and efficient privacy is not really laid out on documentation and contracts, right? Whether when the security controls are not in place, and that's where typically the concerns will be that, okay, there's one aspect of how shall protect my data that I'm sharing or as we are collaborating on it, but the other part is, do I have the runtime and real-time security controls implemented to ensure my data, doesn't essentially get leaked and then results in at a breach scenario and then loss of patient trust.
Yeah, there's this other aspect too. You talk about the approvals for what data movement and collaboration is going to go on. There's also this movement now from a regulatory standpoint towards transparency and explainability, which adds a whole nother layer of complexity for the whole idea about informed consent. Because I mean, if you can't speak plainly about it in terms of a non-technical person's going to understand, that they really can't be truly considered informed. So definitely some additional layers of challenge on top of that.
Right.
But that kind of gets more to some of these privacy regulations that we're hearing about around the transparency. California, I think, was the first one that at least I heard about that was kind of mandating this explainability and transparency. But how do these regulations, institutional risk and governance structures shape what is possible? It seems like there's probably limitation, or at least it feels like there's more than is comfortable. Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear your perspective because I think there's constraints. I mean, data accessibility versus technical capability, those are two different things.
No, that's true, because I think there's obviously a lot of the privacy enhancing technologies, and they have existed even before AI was a real concern, and then we have actually had tried a lot of these capabilities where things like homomorphic encryption, things like differential privacy, things like federated learning, and even trusted execution environment, where it's called as confidential computing, or secure enclaves, where technically all data is basically being accessed within that secure enclave. So at the bottom is that you can get the value from the data without exposing the data itself. But in a lot of cases, some of these have not been very practical or enterprise grade, and not successfully put into practice, right? So in those areas, the concerns around usability of the data, or essentially the performance for those, processes that are operating under those privacy enhancing technologies, have been under question. But there are like other methods who have, which have proved to be more effective, where data de-identification or data desensitization, having those data obfuscated and persistently, protected as they're moving, as they're being stored or being accessed or being, analyzed. So in a lot of cases, those have been proven to be a much better alternative. But each of them has its own effort and engineering and complexity. And in a lot of cases that you either lack, the necessary resources or the funding to implement that. And when it becomes an after the fact, it even gets a lot more invasive and complex and expensive. So then you tend to kind of relax your controls to something that is very default and very traditional of platform level, security, data encryption at rest, right? That potentially, puts the data at risk. But some of these other techniques have been very hard to implement, and that's where I think some of the gaps actually reside.
Yeah, there's definitely some things that are unique. When you talk about the security and all the regulatory and policy-driven things that we have to deal with, having an evolving model is very, particularly with AI, it's a whole different ballgame. And what you got approvals for a month ago, if you don't revisit some of those things, the things that you approved may mean something completely different very, very shortly. And I think that's one of the challenges in addition to the technology, which I think why I have so much respect for the work that you and your company are doing, because there's so many other areas that people have to worry about. This is one they really they need some professionals to be paying attention to it. So the grading, perfect lead into a concept that I've heard you use, but I'd really love to understand a little bit more about it. You've talked about privacy preserving AI. In practical terms, what does that actually mean?
Yeah. So I guess I think I kind of alluded to in the previous question that you had. So privacy preserving AI, technically at the core, it means that without exposing the data itself, you can
Right.
still use the data, right? So that's where I think some of these privacy enhancing technologies and stuff like that, come into
Is
play.
this more in the identification process or tokens or tokenization? How do you
So
cope with?
a lot of it's a combination of various things, and in a lot of cases, either you're picking one versus the other, or sometimes in combination. So the shift, is that from moving data to AI to bringing AI to control data environments. So that's kind of where it all started. That how do you collaborate on the data where that data is actually within a very secure control environment, right? It's like the concept of like secure enclaves, right? So you
Right.
have everything operating under that or within that enclave. So you are bringing your AI and the processing and into that rather than take the data and send it to an AI model, to do the processing stuff, right? Because that's what typically happens these days is like, you're actually sending the data to the models, and do inferences and predictions and stuff. And in a lot of cases, the guardrails that you're putting in is at runtime, you're analyzing on that data that you're putting into the AI, and then basically making sure that the data which are sensitive enough, PHI, PII, that
Right.
technically the model doesn't really need, but everything else around that data is what it is analyzing and inferring on. So how do you at runtime ensure that they are de-identified? Sometimes minimization of the data is also a process that gets into in practice, where only expose what's absolutely necessary, and then after that,
Right.
anything that needs to be sent to the AI model, make sure they are masked or tokenized. Because one thing you'll have to make sure that the model is able to do its job and not hallucinate. Because if you send something and that doesn't make any sense to the model, it obviously will give you results that are not going to be favorable for your process, right? So it's a very interesting balance that needs to be struck. That what you protect and how much you protect, that it essentially gives you the privacy as well as it doesn't make the business process do something that was not expected. And then of course some of the other technologies, we have used. I alluded to homomorphic encryption, trusted execution environment, all that stuff. So it has been very hard to keep data and bring the AI to that secure control environment. So typically, the most frequent and practiced models have been that ensuring how you keep the data and the context secured while you're sending the data to. Yeah, because the part is a lot of cases these AI models are operating externally to the institutions, right? I mean, the hospitals won't have their own models that are built in a lot of cases. So in that case, you are taking advantage of a hyperscaler foundational model that they are hosting. And in that case, even though that's probably by contract or by segregation or logical tenanting, you're keeping that within that particular tenant. But at the end of the day, you're still sending it outside your own environment.
Yeah, I think when we talk about this, basically having the minimum data access that you need to actually accomplish something, I think is definitely something that's a challenge. But as you think about what we can do from a speed and processing standpoint now with AI models, for me, I think that we've talked about this a little bit, so I know that this is one of the areas you're excited about. So for somebody who's really protecting privacy and all that, you're also excited about what's possible. And this is one of the things I really, really appreciate about what you bring to this conversation and what your leadership means across the industry. So when these models work, what kinds of analysis or research become possible that weren't feasible before? I mean, just pause and think back just a couple of years now when we had all of a sudden had COVID vaccines. There's a speed involved there that was never possible before. But from you, I'd love to hear what you're thinking about in terms of what now actually we could consider that we couldn't even think about before.
No, yeah, this like opportunities are so many, right? Even on our side of when we actually build products and then technically what the guardrails that we put in and then take advantage of these models, there were things that probably would have, we would have spent a significant amount of engineering effort and cycles, to get the results that currently with these models we are getting, right? Now, in an enterprise sector like healthcare, it fundamentally changes what healthcare can do with that data, right? I mean, today, a lot of high value use cases are either slowed down or never attempted, not because they are technically hard, but because they are too risky from a data perspective. So with privacy preserving approaches, if they are put in place and they are put in at runtime and they are put in a more contextual and context aware and internalized fashion, that you're making certain decisions as data is moving to these AI models. If you are able to successfully do that, you unlock things like cross-institution research at scale, right? I mean, hospitals and research centers can collaborate on patient cohorts without actually sharing raw PHI. That means better sites, faster validation with more diverse data sets. Sometimes real-time clinical decision support in AI can safely assist physicians using sensitive patient data in the moment, without exposing that data outside the control environment. And then as back office or some of the capabilities from a productivity standpoint, where the billing or any other department that they're using AI co-pilots and agents and clinicians and administrative staff, and they can interact with the AI system without worrying that sensitive data is leaking into external models, right? I mean, I was actually talking to someone who was a founder of a health tech company, and they were solving that how appointment setting, within hospitals, has been a big problem, right? And they try to solve that through AI, analyzing, historical data in terms of patient visits and appointments and how they are staffed and across each hour of the day and across each day of the week and versus each week, month, and so on and so forth. So years of data that they're leveraging in order to help patients get, care much faster rather than having to wait for an appointment or doctor to be available 2 months down the line, right? So, and of course, secondary use of data those are all there, like population health, drug discovery, operational analytics, become far more accessible, be used in a desensitized, controlled fashion.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this is one of the more exciting things because when I was working in New York, we had a dermatologist who was studying some pretty rare conditions because of his practice. And when he was able to get his hands on some de-identified data sets on a larger scale, he was actually able to get enough of a cohort that was statistically significant enough to come to some really remarkable revelations in terms of these rare conditions that he just didn't have enough context for as a clinician to treat. That's just one example, but to me, that makes the work that you guys are doing so much more important, because if we can actually pull a single thread and understand the whole end-to-end life cycle of a patient's record and really understand what's happening there, and we can put that into a larger, context, there's no limit from what I can see. I'm excited about that.
Yep.
There's some unfortunate ways that people think about concepts of privacy and governance in particular. What you're talking about doing something that's a little bit different. You're talking about using them as an enabler. It's not a roadblock. So talk about some of the misconceptions maybe that people have about privacy preserving technologies today.
Yeah, man, I think this is, it has, existed for a long, long time, right? I mean, even my background has been predominantly financial services, even in those, sectors. Whenever it came to implementing data-centric security or privacy preserving capabilities, it's this notion of losing utility of the data. Because typically how data is de-identified or desensitized are with cryptographic measures, whether it's encryption, tokenization, sometimes one-way hash operations that you anonymize that data. It's a kind of a reversible operation, and sometimes you do basic like masking and redaction and stuff like that, right? So all of these are techniques that we have used for decades to keep that data protected and preventing misuse of that data. But for legitimate use cases, when processes are running, the concern is that I will lose the ability to use the data. My business processes are going to break. So if you are heavily masking or distorting data to a point that it's no longer useful. And that used to be, true in a lot of cases where a very rudimentary obfuscation used to be done, like, masking, like make everything XXXX, right? In that case, you lose the referential integrity of a data if there's like the characters have been replaced with that, or you have blanked out, right? Redacted a patient social security number or credit card number. In that case, how do you really operate that on a structured data set?
Right.
And even with probabilistic encryption methods, you actually had different outputs of ciphertext used to get created after you did the encryption of the same data, even with the same key, because every time you do generate a different output. So you are not able to search on that unless you implement certain tag or like a static some sort of a hash to do the searches on that. But with deterministic encryption, format preserving encryption, tokenization, all of these capabilities have enabled you to obfuscate the data and replace a real data with a token or a surrogate of that, and then use that across your workflows. And then you still enable people to search on that data, to join different tables, using that as a primary key, foreign key, all of the database operations that typically gets done. And sometimes, with additional privacy enhancing capabilities, there's a belief that these approaches are too complex and too academic, right? Federated learning, homomorphic encryption, these are hard to optimize. And then in a lot of cases, that's true, right? Because there has to be certain very niche use cases where these, apply well, but they don't apply broadly. Trusted execution environments, these like, where everything is running under this encrypted, memory, and it's all in a secure enclave. Even if you are able to take a dump of that memory and there was a memory leak, still you'll find data encrypted. But they operate in very confines of certain perimeters. But the moment that data leaves, you don't have a homogeneous ecosystem that everything stays encrypted as it moves, and then on the other side, the data gets usable. So I think that's where probably a lot of concern is that I want to innovate, but security privacy is bringing me down, right? I mean, it's a barrier to innovation. And in that case, what happens is they try to find the guardrails, and that's where you find a lot of the shadow AI happening as well. So security and privacy, if they are looked as enablers, and that also has to be proven that they are indeed enabler and still do your job and do more because now these are baked into the design and by default. So you don't have to really implement something because that's one of the friction that would typically innovators feel, right? Oh, now I have to also implement something to take care of privacy and security, and that essentially, drags them away from the innovation and the actual business impact that they're trying to make. But these are some things that have to kind of operate automatically at runtime. And in that aspect, they don't feel the pain and the weight of being the ones who have to implement data privacy and security. And if something just works, then they will not bypass it. So you will have less amount of shadow AI, happening, which puts the enterprises more at risk.
Right. Yeah. Shadow AI is a whole crazy topic that we could probably speak on for a few days because every organization's got, some level of it, probably more than they think, based on this. I'm sure you've seen the same kind of thing in your work as well. We're definitely in a place where there's a growing need. I think the pandemic kind of exposed some things in this regard, that there's a need for collaboration across institutions, which typically has been a little difficult. Why do you think that's been so difficult?
Yeah, I think it's something that has been hard to execute because I think the data gravity combined, with the risk that's associated with it. So every institution holds sensitive patient data, but the moment data leaves its boundary, you lose the control on it, right? And once control is lost, the accountability doesn't go away. It actually getting increased. But in that case, you definitely do not have the direct authority or control on that data and ensure safeguards in place, right? So typically what happens that you err on the side of caution, don't move the data, right?
Right.
So in that case,
Most often, probably.
yeah, you're putting that guardrail because if I can control the data once it's shared, I might as well not share at all, right? And then you have fragmentation, right? I mean, different EHR systems, different data standards, different governance models. And if two institutions, want to collaborate, aligning on how data is accessed and shared and protected becomes a project in itself, right? Because each of these institutions have very different layers or levels of maturity when it comes to their privacy program or data governance or data security program. And in that case, you may have a gold standard on this side, but at the moment the data is shared, and they're probably way less mature in that aspect. So that's where some of the challenges are. And obviously, your privacy and regulatory exposure, violation of HIPAA can mean heavy penalties and long-term scrutiny. Data breaches are happening every day. It's almost unfortunate that we are kind of getting immune to these news unless it has something very, very massive, that impacts every one of us, right? So, and then of course, reputational damage, all of these things are there. So even a well-intentioned collaboration gets slowed down because of these real concerns, given that either the practices or the maturity across the collaboration are not at par, or all of them can't align on the right way of how do we securely share data, how do we collaborate without exposing the data, and then basically that's a model that technically implementation is hard. See, everybody has the right intentions, but sometimes economically, financially, and operationally, sometimes it becomes a very big challenge, depending on how big you are and how many entities you are collaborating with and how much data you're talking about.
Right. Yeah, I think this sets up beautifully one of the things I was really excited to get you to talk a little bit about, because this is really complicated stuff, and I've been living around this risk stuff for quite some time myself. But for people who might not be familiar, how does this capability that you're using, like for example, when I say tokenization, I'm not sure if people understand what that means for a technology standpoint or methodology standpoint, but there's a number of different ways that you are working with solutioning to be able to preserve that privacy within the infrastructure. Well, this will change how partnerships can be approached, but really the role that you and your colleagues are playing is massive advantage for people if they can start to understand enough to be comfortable and confident that you've got a way for them to actually accelerate in ways that they never thought were possible. So how should that cause us to think differently about the way we can approach partnerships?
No, yeah, you're right. I mean, I think this was another conversation that I was having with two co-founders of another health tech, startup that they were actually saying that we don't get the kind of data from the hospitals that we wish we did, and that would have enabled our platforms and our models to actually do a lot better job at the service that we are offering to them. And the only reason that the hospitals were not sharing a lot of those data because they just didn't have a mechanism to send something that they could have a control on, or they would not have the concern of that data getting exposed after they have shared, right? So I think when it comes to that it's a win-win situation for, like, I'm a hospital, I'm leveraging a third party to provide me with a service, and I'm sharing certain data for them to analyze so that they can provide that service. But I'm not sharing enough that they actually would do a superior job on it, and they are constrained within whatever they're getting. So on their side, they're saying we could do a lot more if you only sent us, some of these other data elements. And the hospital's like, okay, I can't really send you that because in that case, I'm going to be now risking patient privacy in a lot of cases because I don't really have a way to do that. So I think instead of asking, how do we securely share data, when it comes to the privacy preserving infrastructure and stuff like that, you shift to, like, how do we collaborate without exposing data, right? And that's a very different model. So you enable data to stay sometimes, within its home environment, and you have a control policy driven access, at runtime. And then based on context, you make decisions about what gets revealed and what doesn't. Right. So in a lot of cases, you bring it home. Or on the other cases where, as you are sharing, then you ensure what gets shared, how much you need, and in that case, what's the context behind this data sharing? Because all data sharing are not the same, right? Understanding that context, the intent behind that sharing, and in that case, what data I should be obfuscating and should actually leave it, as it is. It's a runtime decision, and I think products, solutions that are able to make that runtime decisions are going to enable these partnerships to be more strengthened, right? And in that case, today these partnerships are entirely based on these contracts, right? I mean, it's like this is how it needs to be, but you don't have any control after the fact. So it's kind of more of a legal document versus an implemented security control. So with these privacy preserving infrastructure as well as these different technologies and solutions, these become less about legal complexity and data transfer agreements, but more about controlled interoperability, right? And obviously, the impact is huge that you can move from months of negotiation and hesitation to enabling, joint research, shared analytics, and AI-driven insights much faster.
Right. You mentioned infrastructure. I think this is an important thing too. There's a ton of focus on algorithms, models. How many ways that could go sideways. We can tee that up in another area we could talk about for days. But let's talk about the infrastructure itself. It's to support what you're talking about. How important is the infrastructure to support this?
So I think today there's a lot more focus, is given on the models, right? Like, what model I'm using, and the other part is that how good that model is compared to something else. But real world deployment infrastructure is kind of the difference between a demo and something that actually runs in production, right? So You can have the best model in the world, but if your data layer is insecure, observable, it's not controlled, and it's not cleaned, right? And the data hygiene has been one of those biggest problems, because if it's a garbage in and garbage out thing, right? I mean, you put garbage into something, it is going to cough out garbage regardless of what the model.
Unfortunately, that's the way it works.
So that's as a without having that data layer, that is hygienic, and it's controlled, it's secure and observable, right? You simply can't use it at scale, particularly when it comes to healthcare. So I think the underestimation has been done on the data layer, right? I mean, we have actually put too much of focus on the models and stuff. And it's just not about storing or accessing data anymore. It's understanding the data, like what that data is that is being accessed, what's the context intent behind how it's being used, and then enforce protection dynamically as data flows across these systems and co-pilots and agents. So
Right.
existing infrastructure wasn't designed for that, right? Because it was built for static applications, as I was talking about, that deterministic world, right? The application was developed in this way. This is what it does. These are the data elements it takes in, and this is what it does with that data. This is where it shares or stores. And we move to an AI, non-deterministic world where data is constantly moving, being recombined, being generated, being interpreted in unpredictable ways, and then autonomous decisions are being made because you have not pre-wired an agent, to do a certain thing. I mean, the agent is making decisions on its own. So as this big shift, has happened, in that case, our infrastructure was not kept, or couldn't evolve at that speed. So that's where I think some of the biggest challenges, and that's where technologically we can do a lot. We can build powerful models, process massive data sets, and generate insights in second. But
Right.
operationally, when it comes to data privacy, data security, the question gets asked, like, can we do this safely without losing control of our data, right? And
Right.
right now, that answer in a lot of cases is uncertain, right? And we're not sure. So it's not really the innovation; it's the confidence and control at the data layer, that organizations, do not have, and that's where I think we see that the challenges, and then how AI has kind of outpaced the way enterprises have, built the infrastructure and their governance model.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's obviously a gap that has existed for, long before AI. It's just the expectations of what we can do versus what we could actually implement. I think everyone hopes that there's a that was easy button on the desk they can hit, but
Right.
that's just not the way it works, unfortunately.
I think, we always had these challenges, to your point, but I think AI has just kind of amplified it to, multiple fold, right? I mean, that's where I think the biggest pain point is, because we always tried to catch up with the digital transformation and as things, mature and evolve. But this leap has been very significant, right? And that's where we kind of like find ourselves in a, standing at the bottom of the cliff while, something is way up there, right?
Right. Yeah, it's just we're I don't know, it's just so many different angles to this stuff. And we'll talk a little bit more about, we're digging on trust a whole lot yet. No, I want to talk about that too. But governance, trust, and stewardship. I think people are coming at things with a different level of understanding of what those things are. Trust is another area where we have big challenges in almost every area of life because they are the erosion of trust in human relationships. But what we need to be able to figure out in this kind of environment, when we really do have to be able to share information that's sensitive across the organizations, um, how do you even go about structuring the governance and accountability to really enable this in the way that we're really doing we're doing our duty to really protect and preserve that information?
Yeah, I think this is a tough one. I think easier said than done, right? I mean, the evolution has to be from ownership to shared accountability, right? And with very clear boundaries. Now,
Right.
at a minimum, you need to have few of these layers working together, right? One, that you need to have a clarity on the policies, like everyone agrees what data can be used for what purpose, under what conditions, right? And technical enforcement. If those policies are just like documentation, they're enforced in real time as data is accessed and used, right? And in a lot of cases, that is the biggest pain point. And people can write policies, and I've written myself standards and policies, and where we found that the technical implementation was the biggest challenge, and then typically people would file exceptions to those policies and standards and move on, right? Because that was like
Yeah.
one of the issues. So technical enforcement is like you just don't have a policy so that you can show an auditor that, oh, we have a policy in place, but are those implemented? That is the OD. And the next one is, how do you audit and have a traceability and auditability aspect, right? Every interaction with the sensitive data, that's
Right.
logged, that's visible, that's attributable. Because in a collaborative environment, trust doesn't come from contracts alone, right? It comes from
Right.
very valuable control. So that's where I think some of the things that has to happen. And as I put the disclaimer, easier said than done. But those are some of the foundational ones, and it takes quite a bit of time to get that in
Right.
place.
Yeah, I think that's an area where I think probably there's a lot of folks out there, they're really not sure where they stand. What are some of the signals that the leader might should be maybe looking for that suggest his organization may not be ready to collaborate safely?
This is, I mean, I come across a lot of these when I talk to security professionals or data governance professionals, while talking about their risks and stuff, and you'll be surprised in a lot of cases they have still a lot of I would say reliance or over reliance on some of the static controls that have existed for decades, and that's what
Right.
is perceived to be good enough in the new world. Right? So
Yeah.
and it's like you come to a point where, like, is this an educational moment for them, that, or, and you don't want to obviously talk about like stuff that they personally believe in, or this is something that's their own decision, right? So how do you
Right.
have someone to be a believer when they were a non-believer in some cases, right? So here the governance is mostly like role-based access control policies, contracts. There's no runtime enforcement, and particularly even when data is stored or shared, there are two check boxes that they will check, and as long as they're able to demonstrate that with their auditors, and the auditors are fine with that, like, oh, is your data encrypted on rest? Is your data encrypted in transit? And basically, in both of those cases, you're having TLS, HTTPS, operations that are happening, which checks that box, and anything you put in any database or in a cloud storage, by default, it'll be encrypted at rest, which technically doesn't really do anything from a security standpoint. So these are some of the things that you will find if you're like talking to someone about this, and then they are talking these as their controls, then there's a red flag, right?
Yeah.
Lack of visibility into data flows. If they can't clearly answer where sensitive data is going, especially with AI workflows, they're not right. Today tools like DSPM, data security posture management, they go and to scan different data stores. So it's a point in time visibility of data at rest. But the moment the data leaves, the systems and where they're going, DSPMs and these tools, they can't really tell you. So your visibility into data flows,
Yeah.
if you don't have that, then that obviously they're not ready. And then I think one of the biggest challenges I've had when I was a security practitioner, being part of, whether it's American Express or Worldpay or Activision Blizzard or Micro Focus, um, the ownership of risk, that's very unclear in a lot of enterprises, and particularly the bigger you grow, that's like one of the things that we struggle with. If there was a database that's like a shared data mart or a data warehouse, and a lot of teams are potentially pumping data into it. And then a lot of teams are taking advantage of that data store to, get some information out of it. It's very hard in a lot of cases to understand who owns that data store and basically who owns the risk if that data store actually got, attacked and data breaches happen. And in a lot of cases, what happens is there's one guy on the IT side who manages the server is basically approving request for access to that database, and he doesn't even own the data. But for him, the easiest route is to check on the approve button rather than decline and go through a series of conversation why that person requesting access should need it and whether that's a legitimate risk or not. So basically people taking the easy way route, basically, hey, let approve it. But he will not be the steward of that data, and he would not own the risk if that database got hacked. Obviously, currently you don't even know who has ownership of that data. So that's one of the big issues where it comes to that readiness, right? I mean, do you have very clear ownership of the risk and of the assets? And then, of
I
course,
think even the answer to that question
right.
may not be sufficient. If the answer is important to what you just said, it's like it's just one person. You have a risk.
Yeah, exactly. And that person has like obviously just say I was told that this is a system where everything comes and given nobody actually knew who the data owner was, that maybe, oh, given you own the server or you're the IT person, you approve that. And so that's a very unfortunate thing, particularly in the very complicated and matrixed organization. These are some of the things that are very common. And I think last but not the least, when you have the mentality of block first, if the default approach is to restrict everything because it's easier, than enabling it safely, then it's a clear signal that the infrastructure and the paradigm and the governance model isn't there yet, for adoption. Right. I think those are probably some of the ones that I can think.
Yeah, I mean that's a really important point. And I don't think I've been in a health system in 30 years that didn't have those kind of challenges at some point. As a person who's responsible to create analytics when someone is needing data that I can't go get, it is a little frustrating because you have to be able to explain why you can't meet the objective. And it's really an uncomfortable thing because organizationally, we ought to have our act together so that we can make those kind of decisions when it's really meaningful and important to do so. And, if you're, to your point, if these are the things that you're hearing, this is something that really needs to to get some attention. And again, a very good reason to have my friend Sid here on standby, pick up the phone. But let's talk about the future, because I know we're kind of coming up on time here. As these technologies evolve, how might the healthcare data ecosystem change?
There'll probably be a shift, from institutional centric to a network centric healthcare data ecosystem. I guess, given that all the dominoes fall into place. Today, data is siloed with every hospital, payer, research organization operates within its own boundaries. In the future, data will still, live in those environments, but it'll be accessible, controlled, interoperable way across a network.
Right.
And instead of asking at that point of time, who owns the data, we will start asking, how can this data be safely used across the ecosystem? So I think when it comes to collaboration, my hunch is that some of the things are going to be more common is where we will have a much more federated and distributed research network. Multiple institutions would be contributing, to shared insights without pooling raw data. AI-enabled, clinical ecosystems where co-pilots and agents can operate across systems, but obviously with strict context-aware controls. What can they access and reveal? And potentially a human in the loop, obviously will be there in a lot of cases, particularly for some of the critical processes. And I think for having data clean rooms and secure collaboration environments for players, like pharma, providers and peers work together on analytics, trials, and population health.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to be more context-aware and purpose-driven data access model, right? Rather than
Right.
having role-based access control or attribute-based access control. Is going to be more intent-based, dynamic access controls
Right.
putting in place, because which means basically the same user could see different data depending on what they are trying to do, right? I mean, Sid
Yes.
essentially is trying to access the same data store, but given the prompt that Sid is providing has a very different intent than the last time we did. And even the last time basically we brought some portion of the data. In this, the intent dynamically would be analyzed to say, I mean, no, maybe this is not something I should be exposing to Sid at this point, even though Sid's role is already there to access that data. So I think we'll see a lot more of that getting tightened and more context-driven, dynamic runtime decisions.
There's definitely some noise out there when it comes to what needs to be done for governance and controls, but it seems like there's some other things that maybe people aren't aware of. So from where you stand, what signals are suggesting to you that the industry might be entering a new phase? 'Cause it seems like it might be.
Yeah, I think we're probably getting past that can we use AI mode, right? I mean, it's like, it's kind of inevitable. I think we're going to be moving from that to like, how do we use it safely at scale, right? So then, there's going to be a growing realization that data protection can be an afterthought, right? Which unfortunately, in a lot of cases, it is. And it kind of has to be built into how AI systems operate. And the only way that could happen is when it gets in the runtime mode, gets into the data pipelines and the AI pipelines seamlessly and in a very frictionless manner. Because you can't pre-wire these AI agents and co-pilots any longer, and they don't operate in a very well-defined scope, right? They will make certain decisions. So your guardrails have to be outside, and particularly at that data layer and at the data pipeline layer. And then you'll probably see some, if you're seeing some early adopters shift from blocking the data movement to enabling controlled data usage, which is a very different mindset. Because our typical approach has been, and particularly healthcare and some of the other regulated industries, is that you're either in the monitoring mode or in the blocking mode. And the moment you are in the blocking mode, then obviously you're stopping innovation and you're stopping or actually creating business disruption. And so you have to shift from there is like, how do I allow this pipeline and this process to go through without exposing my data? In that case, you're essentially enabling control data usage and control data movement. So that's where I think some of the signals we will find where we will see that we are actually moving into that new phase.
Yeah, and it's definitely not an if or should we. I think the sudden leap that we all learned about a month or two ago with regard to what OpenAI and Anthropic are doing kind of lights a fire, and there's a ticking clock going down on us where we have the opportunity to get some things right, or we're going to be really far behind it, and it's going to be detrimental. So as we kind of close out, if leaders want to unlock the value of their data responsibly, what are the things they should be paying attention to right now that they may be overlooking? Because I think time for them is of the essence.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if whether there is one thing, right? I mean, that's one of the challenges of security leaders or data leaders in institutions like healthcare. But if they want to unlock the value of their data responsibly, I think right now they would probably want to focus on stop thinking about the data access and the data protection as separate problems, right? Because we have been operating in that model for a long time, and there's a data governance aspect of what data we have and who has access to it, and then the protection essentially doesn't come with that, has not been part of that. In a lot of cases, these teams are probably working together, or sometimes it's under the same leadership. In most cases, they are not. So,
Yeah.
and by data protection, we are again in that blocking mode. So sometimes this party will think the other party as an adversary rather than partners, and that we should be working together. So that separation is exactly, I think, what slowing organizations down. Right? And most teams are still operating in a model where one side is trying to enable access and innovation, other side is trying to restrict and reduce risk, right? And then that creates the friction. And as friction is created, then you have the bypasses happening, right? And in that case, you're inadvertently introducing more risk in the enterprise. So what's often overlooked is the need for this unified runtime approach where access and protection happen together, right, in real time and based on context and intent. So I think these functions and the approaches have to kind of merge. So that's what I would see as one of the very important things. And the other thing is basically like don't over-index on models. The real differentiator won't be which model you're using, but it is how confidently you can use your data with that model, right? Because at the end of the day, the models are fed with data, and then models deal with data, and then that's what they create outcomes based on the data. And it basically means that if you're able to confidently use your data with that model, comes down to visibility, control, and ability to enforce policies dynamically as data moves. Right, so that's what will be required to boost that confidence, regardless of what model I chose. I can use my data with that model.
Yeah, and as we're wrapping up, I just want to encourage the listeners. We're definitely in a period of time where we want to find a way to be able to enable the data to be used in a responsible manner. And this is, I would say, something that might be a little controversial, but I've been part of the healthcare provider sector for a larger part of my life. We often tend to be a little ambitious and think that we're prepared to just build things on our own. Things have gotten so ridiculously specialized, and there's so much time and energy being spent on both sides of an equation. One is trying to advance the capability and stay ahead of those who are trying to penetrate it and do nefarious things. The escalation is constant there. This is not something you want to be a hobbyist to try to solve. Not when you don't want to be a well-meaning person, if just thinking you really can do this. You really need solid partners. And this is where Sid and the team at Privaclave come in from my perspective. And I just want to encourage all of you, I'm going to have a whole bunch of information for you in the show notes. But please take the opportunity to look at this. If you're in a place where you're feeling that pressure, you've got to be able to enable responsible use. This is a conversation that you want to engage in. So please make sure that you take a look and reach out to Sid and his team, because you really have to have solid partners. And if this is not a scenario where you can have 25 different small players that are use case driven. This is a foundational aspect that he's been talking about. So, Sid, I really just appreciate you taking the time, and I think the takeaways for me are many. But you talked about contextual awareness, which really was an important thing as well. And what I hear from you is not stop and roadblock. It's let me help you accelerate. Let me help you do it in a way that's going to protect people and protect their privacy. Um, I love that. As we wrap, before I just close it out, anything that you're thinking about over the next year or so, that could be a real game changer that you've got your eye on. This is one I'm always curious about, because you see things from a different lens, because you're really dealing with things under the covers that most of us don't even understand.
Yeah, I would say it's just to kind of underscore the point I was talking about. I think at the end of the day, AI doesn't create value from models, and it creates value from data. Whoever can use data safely in real time will actually win. And in that case, we'll have to pivot from the perimeter-based type of controls, trying to build bigger walls around the protect surfaces, to focus on the data itself, right? And then by data, focusing on the data itself is essentially not just from a security standpoint, but from its hygiene standpoint as well. So I think a lot more focus will be around the data rather than the systems that are storing the data and their native controls and the network, where these systems actually reside. So I think, at the end of the day, it will um, decide that whoever is actually doing a better job, actually winning, or in a lot of cases, actually succeeding in every sector, they actually have the most cleansed data, and also they're using AI, very effectively with maximizing their usage or introduction of those data into those AI models, because they have taken the privacy and the security aspect well, given that they can confidently push a lot more than typically
Right.
they are able to now. So I think that's what probably my closing thought would be. So because we can't see these two things differently, it all has to come together if
Right.
the AI adoption and the value that we want to generate out of AI is something that in all of our success measures and KPIs will be based on.
Well, I didn't hear you say that, an algorithm or AI are going to be the superstar. So that, I think I think that's heartening for a lot of folks because there's a lot of different fears that are out there, but
Yes.
you're really making me feel a lot better. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. Well, was this too many debates and too many schools of thought on that, and AGI, and of course, those are all
Right.
great topics of here. But yeah, of course, my focus has been pretty grounded at this point to fix the fundamentals, which has been broken for a long time, and
Yeah.
you can't expect different results by doing the same things.
Exactly. There's a term that we call people like that, but I think I'll just leave that. I think people know what it is. But Sid, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been a
Thanks.
fascinating conversation for me. I've learned a lot, and I'm excited for people to be able to hear from you, and looking forward to continuing to follow your successes. I'm quite impressed with what I've seen so far. We've only met just a few months ago, so but I really I can't thank you enough. This has been
Oh,
fantastic.
thank
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah, I mean, it was a great opportunity for me to come to your in a session and then have this dialogue. So really enjoyed the time, and looking forward for more collaboration opportunities, and and same thing, we'll have to see how this whole space plays out, right, over the next
Right.
few years, I guess.
Thank you. That's it for this episode of The Signal Room. If today's conversation sparked something in you, an idea, a challenge, or a perspective worth amplifying, I'd love to hear from you. Message me on LinkedIn or visit signalroompodcast.com to explore being a guest on an upcoming episode. Until next time, stay tuned, stay curious, and stay human.